Exposure compensation is a very useful feature on cameras that I never ever use, but it is useful. It genuinely is useful. With exposure compensation, you are basically telling the camera that you pretty much always disagree with how it's metering the scene. You think it's either making it too bright or too dark, and you will apply an exposure compensation number of either plus or minus, whether you want it to be brighter or darker, and the camera will adjust its settings accordingly. Now, exposure compensation, you can be in any metering mode, in any semi-automatic mode on the camera, doesn't really matter. And then you can choose to compensate the exposure. So for example, in this mode here, we're in standard spot metering, and we don't want to change metering mode, we can choose to use the exposure compensation mode to say we think you're metering a little bit here and we want things to go a little bit darker. So we just turn that dial on the camera usually, and you'll see that the camera takes into account what you set as your priority, and it's moving the shutter speed accordingly. So it's recalculating based upon what you want. As you can see, the camera's making that decision based upon your influence using the exposure compensation mode, which can be very useful on the fly. So again, here we've moved into shutter priority mode. So the camera is going to be moving f-stop. So because we're choosing the shutter. So we're on a tripod here again. So if we want the scene a little bit brighter, increase the exposure compensation, and the f-stop goes up. Darken it with the exposure compensation, and the f-stop closes down even further. Again, of course, never forget that the metering mode plays a much bigger impact. Get your metering mode how you like it, then fine tune it with the exposure compensation. So on some cameras, it's indicated by a square with that's diagonal line dividing it. Half of it's white, half of it's dark, and has a plus and minus symbol in it. On this particular Sony camera, it has a dial that you can just simply turn. Now, on lots of cameras, exposure compensation is only available in the semi-automatic modes because it tells the camera that when it selects a shutter speed, you'd like it to select slightly brighter or slightly darker. Now, in some cameras, not all cameras, it will also be applied in the manual mode. Now, what it does in the manual mode is a little bit counterintuitive. If you have the camera set to f4.5, shutter speed 1/500th, ISO 100, and you increase the brightness via exposure compensation, it raises them all simultaneously, like they're linked, so they're all going up by the same amount. So you will maintain similar depth of field, you will maintain similar balance of depth of field and movement, and the ISO will go up as well. But in every camera I've ever used, that extra information doesn't actually translate to a change in the settings. So some people use it when they feel their camera is faulty or wrong and it doesn't calculate things the way they expect it to. Its real use and its real benefit, in my opinion, is when used in semi-automatic modes, when you feel that your camera tends to select too slow a shutter speed, or too fast a shutter speed, too wide an aperture, or too shallow an aperture. You can use exposure compensation to force it to go slightly the other way. I hope that makes sense. It's a mode you can totally avoid. I do totally avoid it personally because I forget when I've left it on. If you refer back to the other video, you can probably achieve the same by controlling the metering mode.